Welcome to lecture 6.2 in the Legal and Governance series. It's about the governance in the rebuilding of Roombeek, and Roombeek is the area in the city of Enschede that was devastated by a fireworks explosion in the year 2000. We will first describe the role of citizen participation in the rebuilding process. We will then move to governance with private parties, and finally discuss the governance and the municipal supervision. There's a paper connected to this lecture. It's a clock and dentist paper, and in this lecture we will use the first part of the paper. In the next lecture we will use the second part of the paper. In May 2000 there was a major fireworks factory explosion in the area of Roombeek. It killed 23 people, almost 1,000 were injured, and many homes and other buildings were devastated and destroyed. Now you might ask the question why there would be a fireworks factory near to the city center of Enschede. It resulted from the fact that it was located in a former textile factory. Enschede grew big because of textile industrialization, and the city was more or less built around the textile factories that were located pretty close to the city center when the city was still small. This picture shows what Enschede looked like in the heydays of textile industry, when of course they still used steam to run the engines. In the rebuilding process, the city of Enschede decided to have a really intensive and important role for citizen participation. There were a couple of motivations connected to that. The first one was to give citizens from the area, but also the general citizens of Enschede, a voice in rebuilding their neighborhood. The second one was to restore trust. The idea was that trust was reduced because of the fireworks explosion, and that is because the permits that were available for the company did not meet all the conditions that should have been in there, and also the enforcement and implementation of the conditions of the permits were not really in good order. So the idea was that to a certain extent the municipality itself was also to blame for this disaster. The next reason for intensive citizen participation was to create an opportunity to meet. You can imagine that the people who lived in the area were now dispersed over the city because their homes were destroyed. So what they did was to organize meetings for specific sub-areas of the entire area, where people, when coming to these meetings, would again meet their former neighbors. And of course these neighbors were now living in different places in the city. The final motivation was to create a positive energy. So of course you can imagine that it was really a traumatic experience to have to be involved in this disaster. And of course there comes a point in time where the idea is to get on with your life and to create something positive. And of course rebuilding the neighborhood could play a role in that. If we look at the results of the participation process, it's important to understand that there was generally a rather positive atmosphere, so that was successful. There was a high level of participation, so particularly those from the area were pretty active in coming to meetings, and there also was a rather high level of support for the plans that were developed in the process. If we look at the level of trust, we know that after the first rounds of participation, trust was at a similar level that we could measure in other municipalities. We don't have a measurement of trust directly after the disaster, but at least after the first stage of participation it was at a regular level. I will not discuss all the details of how the participation process was organized. You can find that in the paper and you can read it there. What is important is that in terms of the process, it's good to see how the basics were organized. We see a representation of that in this graphical representation. It started with going to the citizens in a large number of participation opportunities. After that, a functional program was developed, so it is about what to do in the area, which activities to employ, and there was a general design in terms of what buildings would look like. These programs were then taken to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, which is the executive organ in Dutch municipal government. After that, the plan that was drafted was then taken back to the citizens to give their opinion again. And only after that there was a real draft plan that was taken to the city council, the municipal council, and they could decide on the plan. So if you would compare that with how things are regularly organized, in many cases first a plan is developed and then that is taken to participation and then for final decision making, or it starts with participation and then the plan that is developed from that is taken directly to the municipal council. Here the citizens were asked their opinions twice, at the very start but also at an intermediate stage before the council was taking its final decisions. Now this is a map of the area that is involved. This is the first plan that was developed. On the top you can see in blue where the area is located in the city of Enschede. So you can also see that this is quite a substantive area that we are talking about. If we look at the area, we can also see that here in this spot the fireworks explosion took place, and then subsequently the destroyed area was around here, and the area on top is connected to it because there was already a redevelopment plan for that area in place. It was not built yet, but it was subsequently combined with the area that we are now talking about. Now the citizens of Enschede were of course the most important actors in the process, but it's also good to pay some attention to some central actors. On the left we see a picture of Peter Bruin, who as an architect with his company was responsible for the design and the supervision of the project. In the middle we see the project alderman, so he was the representative of the Board of Mayor and Aldermen that was responsible for the entire project. To the right we see Joop Hofman, who as a process manager was responsible for organizing the meetings with the citizens. And the reason why I show you these pictures is that they indicate one important aspect of how people look, what their appearance is. Of course, if you are having a central role in the citizen participation, it's important that the citizens have the idea that you truly represent their interests and their opinions. And so what you need is something that we would call street credibility. And it's important to understand that the people from this area were this was a low income area, so the people would not have been highly educated and not the people that you would usually see in citizen participation. So what the municipality did in a very good way is to make sure that the person who was responsible for this process was really seen by the citizens as someone that was going to represent their interests. So it's not someone with a fancy dress or someone that is not one of theirs. No, it was someone that they could see as to be trusted. If we look at the governance of the rebuilding process in the municipal organization, it's important to notice a few things. The first thing I already indicated, there was a project alderman, and this alderman got all the responsibilities within the municipal organization considering this area. So usually there are several aldermen in a city of Enschede, for instance 5 or 6, and one of them would be responsible for social affairs, another for city development, another for infrastructure, and yet another for environmental affairs. And of course this would mean that all these aldermen would have to work together in the area. And this was not seen as something that was beneficial, so one alderman got all the responsibilities. And also all these different tasks would usually be under the responsibility of different departments in the municipality. Again, what they did was they created a special municipal department only for this area, and in this department all the different tasks would be brought together, and also all the different experts that were working on these tasks. Additionally, they also hired external experts. You can imagine that the rebuilding process was an immense task that needed a lot of capacity, and not enough capacity was available, so they hired some external experts as well. Now, of course, the idea of bringing all this together in one organizational unit under the heading of one responsible alderman is, of course, referring to the idea of policy integration. That there is one organization, one department responsible for everything that happened in the area. And of course, in terms of our modes of governance, this is the idea of hierarchy. The idea of hierarchy is you do all things together in one organization, and in this instance, this is in one organizational department. The department was located in the area. You see a picture of the department below, and it was also open for public. So people that wanted to ask questions or had suggestions, they could just walk in the department. It was always open. And this is of course a little bit different than how things are usually organized, because otherwise you would have needed to make appointments and stuff like that. No, the idea here was that people in the area, but also organizations that had tasks to do in the area, they could always just walk in. So this is basically the idea of a network organization. So on the one hand, there is policy integration through hierarchy, but also network organization because of the cooperation with the citizens, but also with a lot of different organizations that are active in the area. It's good to pay some attention to the cooperation with a number of private parties that were involved. There were 5 major ones. 2 of them were housing corporations that owned residential areas in the Roombeek area. The first one was called Domein Housing Corporation. What they did is they developed their own plan on the plot of land that they owned, with participation of the residents that were living in the area. And you can see here the picture of part of the project that they developed in combination with the contribution of the residents. The second housing corporation is the housing corporation Woonplaats. It owned a residential area which was called Roomveldje. It's the picture on the top. We will discuss the development of that project in a separate micro lecture 6.3. And in that lecture we also pay some attention to the development of the Prismare project. 2 other projects they were involved in: Balengebouw, that's to the left bottom, and to the right Menko. The first one, the Balengebouw, is still open currently. There is use for some organizations. The Menko building block is currently developed into housing apartments. Now, when we discussed the map, we already indicated that there was already a project to reconstruct, to redevelop the east and northern part of the area. This was an area where old textile factories were also present, but they were not in use anymore, or at least to a large extent. There was a fully developed plan for this area with the involvement of 3 major private parties. So there was private public-private partnership here involved between the municipality of Enschede and these parties. Now, this plan had been formalized, and part of it was already on sale, but there was not a lot of it was sold already at the moment that the fireworks explosion took place. Now, of course, because you've perhaps paid some attention already to the legal lectures relating to public-private partnerships, and of course you know that when you formalize these things, there are certain rights that these parties can take from the formalization, from the contracts that were made. Now, the idea was that when the explosion came, it was best to have a fully newly integrated plan for the entire area, because they felt that this was an opportunity to make sure that this was like one whole and one integrated plan. Of course, by doing that, the building rights that the three private parties had created a governance problem. They had to be solved because one way or another they had to be given a role in the new program, in the new integrated plan, because because there were signed contracts, and because of that there were certain rights, and they had to be taken care of. Now, the first private partner was Te Pas. This is a firm that is usually active in construction but also in development. They had a position in the former plan, and the way how they solved this was that they were given building capacity. So they were allowed to be active in the building of a couple of buildings, and the main ones are Prismare and Menko. Now, if you have been studying procurement law and the lectures about that, of course you know that the municipality is not allowed to just give a contract for construction to a company that they like. There has to be open competition, and the rules in terms of procurement, the European rules, are pretty strict on that. Now, the way how they solved this is that they let the housing corporation, Woonplaats, do the development. So officially the Woonplaats was building these buildings, and Woonplaats under Dutch law is a private company. You could say that they have something like a public task, but in legal terms they are a private company. And of course, for private companies, these strict procurement laws that apply to public organizations, they don't apply. So they were able to just give the jobs of the building those buildings and redeveloping them to this Te Pas construction firm. Now, this previous example was the presentation of building rights to the company, which is more in line with the development rights model that has been discussed in the legal lecture on organizational models and public-private partnerships. There is another example that looks more like the concession model. This was the company of Ter Stege that is much more active in development but also in construction. They owned a plot of land in the area in the former plan, and they were given another part in what was called the Roombeek. So there was an exchange of land. The land that they owned was given to the municipality, and from the municipality they got a plot of land in another part of the area. And with the land they got the right to develop business units and houses in the area. So again, they were given the ownership of the land, and they could develop themselves the entire area with the kind of houses and business units that they would like. A final private partner was the Bouwfonds Housing Development Corporation. They are mainly active in larger scale housing development. And in the new plan this was not possible. There were two areas already indicated that were owned by the housing corporations, and in other parts of the plan there was no space for a larger scale housing development. So what the municipality did is that they paid them a limited amount of compensation for the fact that they had these previous rights in the old development plan. So in this way they were like compensated for the fact that they could not build according to the rights that they had in the former project. Now, if you want to understand the governance of the project, it's important to pay attention to a couple of other aspects. The first one is about money. Money is always very important, and what was relevant here that there was a quite large additional budget that was available. It came from national government, from regional governments, and also from very different sources. So there was plenty of money available to organize the process in a decent way, but also to develop nice plans in terms of the actual building projects. A second point that's very important is that you, from the legal lectures, you already know that ownership of land is a very important aspect when you talk about development of different projects. Now there were two ways in which the municipality made sure that they owned most of the land in the area. The first one was the preemption rights. They are discussed already by Fred Hopma in his lecture. And the second one was by the demolition plan. You can imagine that, of course, the area was devastated, but the people who owned a house, the private owners, their house was destroyed, but of course it had to be demolished. And in order to do that, you need a permit, and that was given by the municipality. And of course, there are also costs involved because you have to remove the debris. Now, what the municipality offered to all these private owners was that they would take care of the demolition. So they would take care of all the permits. They would basically give it to themselves, and they would also take care of the costs in exchange for selling your plot of land to the municipality. So if you sold your land to the municipality would take care of the demolition. Now, what that idea was accompanied by the fact that you could recoup your land, or at least the area that you were looking for. So there was, and that's the next point, support for individual building projects. So there was a land for land right. If you sold a plot of land to the municipality, you would also have the right to buy a plot of land of the same size from the municipality. Not necessarily the same plot, but at least of the same size. And of course, having the ownership of that plot of land would give you the right to build your own house again. And what was also important was that there was large freedom to design and build on an individual level. So there was a lot of freedom, much more than usually is the case in the Dutch system, for individual households to design their own house and to really build it on their own, hiring, of course, architects and construction firms. That was accompanied also with a subsidy on professional advice. So, of course, most people are not in the habit of building their own house, so they lack a lot of expertise and they have to hire it. That's expensive, but there was a subsidy provided for that by the municipality, and of course the additional budgets were used for that. And as indicated, there was a lot of freedom, but there were actually different levels of supervision. So there were some parts of the area where you could do almost anything you would like, and there were other areas where there was a larger supervision in terms of the regulations that you had to meet in terms of what the buildings would look like. Now this all was combined in one concept, and that was called Build Your Own Dream in Roombeek. So the idea here was to give individual citizens much more opportunity to build their own house than would normally be the case in a Dutch situation. It's good to have a quick look on what these different levels of supervision entail. Now there is the low level of supervision, which indicates a high freedom for you to design your own house. There's only some provisions in terms of the type of building, so is it a house or something else, an area specification, and some provisions in terms of height and location. The next level is the medium level, where in addition to the first 3 points, it's also about the division of the facade and the shape of the roof. And then there is the high level of supervision, where much more detail is regulated, materials and colors, but also the shape of the building. And there is even one extraordinary high level of supervision, where the municipality would even mingle with the selection of the architect. How they did this is that in the contract, that when you buy the plot of land, there's a provision that you can only hire an international renowned architect, and this had to be judged by Peter Bruin as the general supervisor of the area. Now, if you have been studying procurement law and private law and public law in general, you will know that it's absolutely not legal that the municipality will interfere with your selection of an architect. It can't be done under public law, so they tried to do this, and they actually did this under private law, and again in the contract when you buy the plot of land, but even there this is not allowed. So if you would have been interested in getting your name into case law as a interesting case of you against the city of the municipality of Enschede, you could have bought yourself a plot of land and then taken them to court and to fight this provision that they would have to be able to mingle with the architect. Unfortunately, no one did this or bought a plot of land in the area, so the municipality got away with this way of organizing things. That's it. In this micro lecture we discussed and described the role of citizen participation, how this was organized. We discussed the governance within the municipality, but also in combination with private partners. We discussed that this was, on the one hand, involved some hierarchy, but also some network partnerships. And we discussed some specific issues in relation to the governance with specific partners, but also the level of municipal supervision.